I must have tried on at least 5 different dresses before finally choosing the dark green one, the one that made my waist seem just a touch slimmer and my arms a bit longer. The heels were brand new, expensive in a way that still made me a little nervous, the kind of shoes meant for special occasions and glass floors, not cubicles and scuffed office carpet. But tonight wasn't the office. Tonight was the annual Winston Unlock dinner. Every year, the firm hosted it as a black tie affair at Belladine, the kind of place people talked about in hushed, reverent tones. Velvet booths that swallowed you whole, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, wine bottles locked behind glass like museum artifacts, older than half the interns we'd hired that year. For weeks, the event had hovered over the office like myth: who made the list, who didn't, which partners would attend, what the CEO might hint at after a few drinks, whether some quiet scandal would finally surface once the champagne loosened tongues. It was my first year. I'd only been at the firm 10 months, but I'd been relentless in operations, staying late, cleaning up messes from poorly written vendor contracts, quietly stabilizing systems no one noticed until they failed. I'd even earned a small employee spotlight in the October newsletter, though it was tucked beneath a glowing feature about someone's golden retriever. Still, I was excited, more than excited. I was ready. I'd had my hair done that morning, something I almost never splurged on. I'd booked a makeup artist for the first time in my life and felt slightly ridiculous sitting in my kitchen while someone dusted my face like I belonged somewhere glossy. I spent far too much money on a dress I knew I'd probably only wear once. I even ordered a cab so I wouldn't arrive flustered and breathless from the subway. I planned every detail. I wanted to walk in calm, polished, like I belonged there. When the car pulled up, the restaurant looked unreal, glowing like a jewel box against the night. Valet attendants moved with practiced grace, soft jazz floating out onto the sidewalk. I stepped onto the pavement and felt, just for a moment, like someone who mattered. Inside, a hostess in a sleek black dress stood behind a podium, a gold-trimmed guest list resting beneath her fingers. "Name, please," she said, smiling professionally. Margaret Marne. I'm with Winston and Locke." Her finger traced down the page, then slid back up. The smile wavered. "I'm sorry, could you spell that?" I did, slowly, twice. She checked again, flipped to another page, then offered a small, apologetic shrug. "I don't see you here." My stomach dropped. There must be a mistake. I was told the invite went to everyone on the operations team. I RSVP'd. She glanced toward the maitre d'. "I'm afraid this is a closed guest list. If your name isn't on it—" The space around me seemed to shrink. I could hear the clink of glasses, low laughter, the hum of money and comfort. The air smelled like roasted duck and white truffle. Through the glass doors, I could see my coworkers already inside, already sipping wine, already pretending they liked one another. Brian from finance met my eyes for half a second and then looked away. That was when I heard his voice behind me. "Oh," he said, laughing softly, "you showed up." I turned. "What?" "I mean, I figured you'd catch on by now." He smirked. "This dinner's kind of senior team only. We couldn't invite everyone." Then, with a grin that made my skin prickle, he added, "But hey, there's a KFC down the block if you're hungry." He laughed like it was clever, like it was harmless. I didn't say anything. I smiled because he had no idea that in a few hours his entire career would depend on me, and I had one step left, just one. I stood there framed by gold-lit glass and the hush of expensive conversation, my heels sinking slightly into the carpet, like the floor itself was trying to pull me under. I hadn't even worked much on the campaign they were celebrating, some flashy digital rollout for a luxury automotive client. My name wasn't on the slide decks or printed menus or cocktail napkins. But Brian didn't know everything. In fact, Brian didn't know much at all. He didn't know that I'd gone to school with Grace Whitman, the same Grace who now handled PR strategy for the automotive giant's CEO. He didn't know that Grace and I still spoke regularly, that she still called me when she wanted real opinions instead of polished, press-approved language. He didn't know I'd worked at Halverson and Company before this, the legal consultancy that drafted the compliance framework the entire campaign rested on. He didn't know the licensing language was fragile, that one poorly interpreted clause could unravel everything if the wrong person looked too closely. And more than anything, he didn't know that 2 days earlier, while doing a quiet favor for IT, I'd uncovered an unpatched vulnerability in the firm's cloud archive. A small thing, easy to miss, but pull the right thread and the entire campaign, the glossy celebration he was toasting with champagne, could fall apart in hours. I hadn't reported it yet. I was watching, waiting. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't even angry, not exactly. I was remembering. The way Brian laughed when I offered to help with budget models, the way he skipped over me in meetings, how he once called me Marcy and never corrected himself, the office party where he took credit for fixing a vendor compliance issue I'd handled quietly on my lunch break. To him, I was background noise, a name he didn't need to learn, a face that would never matter. People like Brian never see you coming. As he turned back toward the warmth of the restaurant, smug and satisfied, I stayed just outside the frame, not hungry, not wounded, just ready. Ready to make one decision, one move. I hadn't made it yet, but I would. I should have known better to expect dignity from Brian. He'd always made a sport of needling me, little comments dressed up as jokes, cuts so small you were expected to laugh them off. It started with where I was from, a town no one bothered to look up, a place where kids grew up fast and options were limited. My dad was a mechanic, my mom worked nights at the Dollar Save. We didn't have vacation homes or networking events. We had casseroles and oil-stained hands. I was never polished. I was soft, softer than most girls, chubby in a way that made me disappear in group photos. I didn't own a straightener until college. I only learned what toner was 6 months ago, and even now, after everything, I still catch myself pulling my stomach in when I pass reflective glass. Still here, the way Brian once said it. You've got such a friendly face. You remind me of a lunch lady. I laughed then, pretended it didn't sting. Just like now. You could try KFC, he said again, dripping with mock concern. That's more your speed, right? My fingers tightened around the clutch I'd bought just for tonight. Cream satin, gold clasp. The most elegant thing I owned. I forced a smile. Thanks, Brian. I'll remember that. He smirked and walked back inside, toward champagne and laughter, and the people he believed mattered. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just a nobody in operations. I wasn't a clerical error on a guest list. I was the reason the Henderson contract closed last quarter. I was the one who flagged the offshore clause they'd nearly missed, the one that would have exposed the firm to litigation in 3 countries. I quietly looped in the senior legal team through a contact at Durham and Stratton and saved an entire quarter's numbers. No one asked, no one noticed. And now Brian had humiliated me, treated me like I didn't belong. It was a mistake, because I was done being quiet. One step, one email, one conversation, one truth placed in the right hands. That was all it would take, and it was sitting in my pocket. I still remember the sound the front door made when it closed, that hollow wooden thud that meant no one else was home. The house in Willowbend was nothing special. Peeling white siding, a driveway that turned to mud every spring, but it was ours. My father bought it with a VA loan, the one thing his service gave him that endured. My mother filled it with secondhand furniture and stubborn hope. I grew up there, watching mold creep across the ceiling like a slow bruise, pretending the heat worked past October. When my father died and the medical bills came, there was no time for sentiment. I was 22. I signed the papers myself. We sold the house for just under $90,000. That money was supposed to mean survival. Rent, food, a car. Instead, I bought a foreclosure on the edge of a gentrifying neighborhood. I spent 6 months fixing it with my own hands, learning from YouTube videos and contractors who assumed I was someone's girlfriend. I rented it out for double the mortgage. Then I did it again and again. By 25, I owned 3 properties outright. No debt, messy taxes, chipped nails, and leverage. I kept it quiet. People get uncomfortable when the soft girl from nowhere has money, or worse, knows how to use it. The first person who truly saw me was Mr. Harrow. I took a community business course just to double-check my accounting. He was a guest speaker on logistics strategy. I asked a question about distribution bottlenecks. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're not just managing cash. You're building something, aren't you?" I shrugged. "I want to run my own firm someday. Maybe logistics consulting." "You will," he said. "You already think like a manager." That stayed with me. Every job after that, including Winston & Lockitch, was chosen deliberately. I didn't need the paycheck. I needed the exposure, the structure, the dysfunction. I watched power games, I watched panic. I learned how companies cracked under fragile egos. I learned how I would do it differently. So when Brian joked about KFC, when he treated me like an inconvenience, he wasn't just mocking my dress or my body or my background. He was mocking everything I survived, everything I built, everything I'd been quietly preparing. I didn't fight back that night. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. But I did make a call the next morning, one that would turn the ground beneath Brian's feet into quicksand, because I was done being the girl they forgot to include. I was ready to be the woman they answered to. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, not exactly. The anger had already passed. What came after was colder, quieter, clarity. They hadn't just left me off a list. They'd made it clear I didn't belong. At least, not in their eyes. But I didn't need to shout or burn the place down to make my point. I just needed to leave and take everything I knew with me. At 8:03 the next morning, while the others were still recovering from their wine-soaked victory toasts, I opened my laptop and typed a short message. Subject, coffee. "Hi, Natalie. I'd love to catch up. Are you still looking for someone to lead implementation over at Stratfield Group? Let me know." Natalie Tran was the operations director at Stratfield, one of Winston & Lockitch's main competitors. We'd met at a networking panel last spring and clicked instantly. Unlike Brian, she remembered my name, and unlike the smug inner circle I'd been orbiting for nearly a year, Natalie actually listened when I spoke. Her reply came 20 minutes later. "Yes, let's talk today. I've been hoping you'd reach out." By the end of the week, I'd signed a new contract, Senior Operations Associate, client-side strategy, flexible hours with a clear growth path. They didn't lowball me. They didn't ask where I came from. They asked what I wanted to build, and I told them. Stratfield was different. The team was sharp, hungry, and kind. Here were no performative meetings, no ego battles. Everyone carried their weight. Everyone gave credit. It felt like stepping into a room where the air wasn't just cleaner, it was breathable. And I thrived. Within 6 months, I was promoted. By month 9, I was managing 2 of our largest logistics clients, one of which Winston & Lock had been chasing unsuccessfully for years. I never rubbed it in. I didn't have to. The numbers spoke for themselves. And then one afternoon, as I stepped out of a client debrief, Natalie stopped me in the hallway. "Hey," she said, smiling. "Small update. We just got a call from Henderson Group." My eyebrows lifted. "The automotive client?" She nodded. "Yeah, they're pulling out of Winston & Lock, looking for new partners. I think they're disillusioned." I smiled politely, like it wasn't the sweetest thing I'd heard all week. And guess who they asked to speak with first? You. It took everything in me not to laugh, not to run downstairs and scream it into traffic. Brian had once joked about fried chicken while sipping champagne he didn't pay for, and now he was probably sitting in a glass office wondering why his most valuable client had suddenly gone cold. But that was the thing about me. I didn't raise my voice, I raised the bar. And now I was sitting at the head of the table while he was scrambling to keep his seat. Long before I walked into Stratfield's sleek, sunlit offices, I knew Winston & Lock would come knocking. It was inevitable. We were chasing the same clients, bidding on the same contracts, speaking at the same conferences. And unlike Winston with its bloated executive layer and outdated workflows, Stratfield was lean, sharp, and hungry. Natalie even warned me early on. "They're not going to like that you're here," she said over coffee our first week. "You were one of their inside people, even if they never treated you like one." I just smiled. They don't even know I left. They think I disappeared. But I hadn't disappeared. I was watching, planning, preparing. The week after Brian humiliated me at Belladine, I found something I wasn't meant to see. I was running a routine system backup, a side favor for an overwhelmed IT analyst, when I noticed something strange. A shared folder on Winston's internal server with no encryption and only partial firewall protection. Someone had misconfigured a syncing protocol during a security update, and for roughly 48 hours, that folder had been wide open to anyone with access to our internal project tools. Inside were drafts, contract templates, pitch decks, internal notes, compliance reports, everything from vendor discussions to campaign strategy. I didn't copy everything, I'm not that reckless, but I did take the documents that named our clients directly, especially those tied to licensing structures, client-side dependencies, and pricing projections. I didn't take them for revenge, I took them because I knew I'd need them one day, and now that day had arrived. Winston & Locke was officially on Stratfield's radar. One of our newer clients, a major logistics and warehousing firm, had received proposals from both of us and Winston & Locke. The deal was worth millions, a multi-year implementation across 5 continents, the kind of contract that reshapes balance sheets and builds careers. Natalie called a strategy meeting. "I want full analysis," she said. "I want to know their playbook before they even walk into the room." I already had it saved in a private folder on my desktop labeled innocuously as Market Reference East. I'd been updating it over time, cross-checking public releases, internal rumors, even comparing proposals when clients forwarded them for feedback. I didn't change anything. I didn't fabricate. I simply connected dots no one else could. I knew their blind spots, their weak language, their habit of overpromising back-end development timelines. I knew Brian's pitch rhythm, where he'd get cocky, where he'd hedge. So when Natalie asked, "Do you think we can outbid them?" I answered without hesitation. "Not only can we outbid them," I said, "we can outmaneuver them." Because what Winston and Lack didn't understand was that they hadn't just excluded someone from a dinner, they had handed a strategist to their biggest threat, and I was no longer sitting at their table, I was setting it. I spent the next 2 weeks working behind closed doors. No team meetings, no Slack chatter, no public document trails with my name attached. I didn't need recognition, I needed precision. The negotiations with Lexicon Freight Systems, the multi-million-dollar logistics firm both Stratfield and Winston & Lack were chasing, were scheduled for the end of the month. It would be a closed-room pitch followed by a private candid session. 2 partners, 1 analyst, and, of course, Brian. I saw his name on the shared vendor update when Lexicon forwarded the list. My pulse didn't jump. I didn't get angry. I just smiled, because I knew Brian wouldn't expect me, he wouldn't prepare for me, and if I stayed hidden long enough, I could steer the entire deal from behind the curtain without him ever realizing I was there. So I made a request. During a prep call with Natalie and our senior strategist, I said casually, "Keep me off the participant list." Natalie lifted an eyebrow. "Why?" "I want Brian blind. The second he knows I'm here, he'll overcorrect. He'll get cautious, and I want him comfortable, arrogant." Her smile was slow, pleased. "You're not just going for the win, are you?" "I want him to dig his own grave," I said simply. "I'll hand him the shovel." She leaned back and laughed softly. "God, I love you." So that was the plan. Publicly, Stratfield's pitch team would be Daniel from client development, Tina from financial modeling, and Natalie as lead. Privately, I would be orchestrating every word. I rewrote proposal language, refined cost models, crafted soft rebuttals for every predictable claim Winston would throw at Lexicon, and just for fun, I added a quiet clause to our delivery strategy, one that directly addressed a supply chain redundancy issue Winston had repeatedly failed to solve in past pitches, something Brian had dismissed as industry noise. It wasn't noise, it was bleeding money. But he never noticed because people like him never looked past the mirror. So while he polished his smile and prepared his usual performance, I layered our strategy with substance, with traps, with contrast so sharp it would make their pitch look like a high school group project. They wouldn't see it coming because Brian still thought I was invisible and I was about to become unforgettable. The meeting room at Lexicon Freight Systems looked designed to intimidate. Steel-framed windows, a black marble conference table, chairs that creaked if you shifted wrong, just to remind you not to. Natalie and the rest of Stratfield's official team were already seated when Winston and Lack entered, suits pressed, smiles sharp, confidence spilling like cologne, and right at the center of their group, Brian. His hair was slipped back, probably too much. His tie, some loud paisley thing, screamed, "I'm important." He strolled in like the room belonged to him, like Lexicon should be grateful he showed up. I was in the adjoining observation room, watching through mirrored glass, every detail unfolding in real time. He didn't see me, not yet. Natalie opened with a calm, composed summary of our strategy, heavy on numbers, light on fluff, just enough substance to set the tone. Then it was Winston's turn. Brian cleared his throat, did that insufferable, casual nod he thought made him look relatable, and launched into his pitch. I recognized every line. I'd written most of them a year earlier, but then he pivoted. He pulled up a new slide, one I'd never seen before, and the moment it appeared, I nearly laughed out loud. It was a modified logistics efficiency projection, color-coded, glossy, and completely wrong. I blinked, then leaned closer. He'd reused an old model, one that had been flagged for faulty input ranges during Q3 last year. I remembered the incident. He never fixed it, just renamed the file and buried it in another deck, and now he was presenting it to Lexicon as real-time data. Natalie glanced toward the mirrored glass just once, and that was my cue. I stepped into the room. Every head turned. Brian's face locked up. He tried to cover it with a smirk, but his eyes widened just enough to betray him. "Margaret," he said, like the name didn't belong in his mouth. "Good to see you again," I said, taking the seat directly across from him, calm, polished, intentional. "I wasn't aware you were with Stratfield." "I asked not to be on the attendee list," I replied lightly. "Surprise." One of the Lexicon executives shifted in his chair, suddenly interested. "Ms. S. has been overseeing our comparative review. She's quite thorough." Brian flinched, then tried to recover. "Well," he said, snapping his report shut, "I'm sure she'll appreciate our projections." I took the remote and pulled up a second version of his chart. "This projection," I said, pointing to the screen, "uses outdated cost curves from 2 fiscal years ago. It also fails to account for Lexicon's expanded European corridor, which you've incorrectly modeled as a static cost line." He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Also," I continued, advancing the slide, "you've omitted currency fluctuation factors from the South American routes, which, as you know, could shift net efficiency by up to 17%. Silence. I turned to Lexicon's team. At Stratfield, we reran the numbers using real-time corridor data and dynamic adjustment curves. We'll email you the full simulation model after this." Brian's face darkened, his jaw tightening so hard I thought it might crack. "Margaret," he muttered, "we can talk about this later." "No," I said without looking at him, "we'll talk now, in front of the people it matters to." He looked at Natalie, then at the Lexicon team, and for the first time since I'd known him, Brian had nothing clever to say. because I hadn't just caught him making a mistake, I'd caught him doing what he always did, cutting corners and hoping no one sharp enough would notice, except someone had, and now he was cornered, exactly where I wanted him. Brian didn't bother hiding his fury. The moment the meeting adjourned, he nearly slammed his laptop shut, teeth clenched so tight they might shatter. His handshake with the Lexicon executive was stiff and rushed, like a man who wanted to run but had nowhere left to go. I didn't follow him. I didn't gloat. That wasn't my style. Natalie leaned in as we packed up our notes. Think he'll recover from that? I gave her a thin smile. Only if someone hands him a new personality. Later that afternoon, back at Stratfield HQ, the mood was light, almost celebratory, but I didn't uncork the champagne yet, not because I wasn't confident, I was, but because I knew Lexicon wasn't finished.
Clients that big didn't make billion-dollar decisions in one boardroom. They liked drama. And right on cue, it came the next morning. A sleek envelope hand-delivered by a courier dressed like he'd stepped out of a movie. Inside was a single letter embossed with the Lexicon seal, addressed to strategic partners from the Executive Board of Lexicon Freight Systems. Following yesterday's preliminary presentations, the board has elected to extend the selection process. Both Stratfield Group and Winston & Lockitch will be invited to deliver final proposals at an exclusive negotiation summit this Friday. Location: the Imperial Room, Blackstone Grand Hotel. Time: 11 a.m. Format: private presentation, closed, confidential evaluation. Natalie raised an eyebrow. "The Blackstone Grand," she said. "That's the most expensive hotel in the city." I finished it for her. Of course they want a show. They were about to get one. We spent the next 3 days preparing like we were heading into battle. Every slide, every answer, every whisper of data had to be razor sharp. But this time, it wasn't just about content. It was about presence. Lexicon had already seen me in a cornered room calling out mistakes. Now they would see me owning the room. Meanwhile, word traveled fast. By Wednesday afternoon, we received confirmation from a third-party contact that Winston & Lockitch was in complete disarray. Brian had reportedly screamed at his analyst. There were quiet murmurs that someone from compliance was now reviewing his numbers. Too little, too late. And Brian himself hadn't reached out. Not a single message, not a snide email, not even a cryptic jab, which told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't regrouping, he was panicking. And come Friday, he'd have to walk into the most prestigious conference room in the city and pretend he hadn't been outmaneuvered by the background girl he once laughed out of Bellardine. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was building a legacy. Friday arrived with surgical precision. The Blackstone Grand. White columns, gold trim, staff trained to make you feel wealthy just by proximity. The Imperial Room sat on the top floor, wrapped in glass with a panoramic view of downtown, like the city itself was holding its breath. I arrived early, not because I needed time, I was ready, but because I wanted to watch Brian walk in. This time I wasn't behind mirrored glass. This time I was seated at the table. The final participant list had been submitted to Lexicon's legal team 2 days earlier. Stratfield had requested to lead the joint review of all prior reports, including Winston & Lockitch's revised model, and when their admin called to ask if Brian should be included, I answered plainly, no. There was a pause. May we ask why? Because he's unable to submit a report, I said calmly. There's no reason for him to be there. I let the silence stretch, then added, tell him there's a KFC down the block if he's hungry. It was the first time I'd said it out loud, and it tasted better than I expected. Now, in the Imperial Room, I stood near the tall windows, sipping water like it was champagne, as Winston & Lockitch's delegation filtered in. Brian entered last. He paused in the doorway, scanning the table, clearly expecting to see his name. It wasn't there. He blinked, then blinked again, as if the room might rearrange itself if he waited long enough. Natalie greeted their team with composure, then turned to the Lexicon representative beside her. We've decided to streamline today's agenda, she said. Only data-submitting representatives will participate. The Lexicon lead nodded. That was our request as well. Clean room, real work. Brian's face tightened. There must be a mistake. I'm not on the list. No, I said, turning to face him fully. I didn't include you, Brian. I said again, louder, clearer. You haven't submitted a single accurate projection in 2 quarters. You're not here to pitch, you're here to observe. A few heads turned. Lexicon's legal team didn't bother hiding their amusement. I stepped closer, my voice calm but deliberate. There's a fast food place on the corner. Maybe grab something for old time's sake? Brian's eyes darkened, his fists clenched, but he didn't speak. He couldn't, because any word would confirm the one thing he feared more than being wrong, that he no longer mattered here. He turned sharply and walked out, his shoes striking the marble hallway, each step echoing a little louder than the last. I watched him leave, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just calm, because this wasn't vengeance, it was balance, and this time I held the pen. After Brian exited, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was subtle, like a plane steadying after turbulence. The rest of the Winston and Lockage team tried to act as if nothing had happened, but their discomfort clung to them like thick air. You could hear it in their clipped voices and see it in their stiff posture. They were exposed now, vulnerable. I took my seat at the center of the long glass table and opened my laptop. My slides were already cued, clean, precise, unflinching. Lexicon's senior director leaned forward. Stratfield, you may proceed. I didn't stand, I didn't pace or make dramatic gestures. That wasn't who I was. I clicked to the first slide, an interactive supply chain dashboard I had rebuilt from the ground up, and began to speak. Calm, clear, undeniable. This is your current logistics model, I said. What we're proposing isn't just a replacement, it's a reinvention. For the next 40 minutes, I guided them through every layer of our proposal. We addressed their pain points not with buzzwords, but with real solutions. Automated load balancing, redundant route mitigation, dynamic fuel cost projections, real-time vendor scoring. I spoke to them as partners, not prospects, and they listened. They asked hard questions. I answered everyone, not because I'd memorized responses, but because I knew I'd built this proposal into my bones. It wasn't just figures on a screen, it was my fingerprint. By the time I finished, you could feel it, that collective pause when a room has already decided, but is still pretending to be impartial. Lexicon's lead stood. We'd like to break for 10 minutes. We'll reconvene for a final vote. When they left the room, Natalie turned to me. You just buried them. I shook my head. I didn't bury anyone. She smiled. Then what do you call it? I outgrew them, I said, and finally let them see it. When we returned, Lexicon's senior director didn't hesitate. We'd like to proceed with Stratfield Group, he said simply, contingent on the implementation timeline and compliance review. We'd like to begin onboarding immediately. A ripple moved through the room, not gasps, not applause, just quiet awe. Natalie leaned toward me. You want the final word? I stood, smoothed the front of my blazer, and nodded. Thank you, I said, meeting each face around the table. We don't take this lightly. You'll have our full team, full commitment, full transparency, starting today. One of Lexicon's lawyers slid a contract folder across the table. Please note, he added, almost casually, we've requested one special clause prior to execution. I glanced down, read it once, read it again, a single line. Winston and Lockage employee Brandon H. shall be excluded from any current or future collaborative efforts involving Lexicon Freight Systems and Stratfield. I looked up. The director met my eyes and shrugged. Our team prefers working with professionals who don't manipulate data. I said nothing. I didn't smile. I simply picked up the pen and signed.